Boa noite a todos. Hoje vamos começar com os webinars do Ibero-American Beer Cup, que supostamente seria este ano a sua primeira edição, mas devido à pandemia vamos ter que adiar mais um ano, infelizmente. Esta noite vamos ter uma apresentação do Dave Carpenter, ok? É uma pessoa que já conheço há uns anos. Conhecemos-nos em Espanha, num congresso. Tem um livro sobre lagers, muito bom, que eu recomendo e que ele vai falar sobre ele também. É editor da revista Simorgi, ok? E é da Associação de Brewing americana, ok? A apresentação desta noite, o David tem... Havia muitos temas em que o David podia falar e podíamos ficar aqui bastante encantados com a apresentação dele. Mas decidimos começar por um tema que são as lagers, são cervejas lagers, como fazer cervejas lagers. Que é um tema que às vezes em homebrewing é um tema bastante... São cervejas que não são fáceis de fazer, é preciso certas temperaturas, certos ambientes para fazer a cerveja. Ok? Só fazer uma pequena introdução do David e vamos passar já para o David, que está aqui à nossa espera já e com a apresentação prontinha. Hello, David. How are you?
Hello, good, thanks. How are you?
I'm fine. Good night from Lisbon, of course, and good afternoon in Colorado.
Yes, good afternoon from sunny Colorado.
Okay. David, I make a little presentation, but you, of course, you have a lot of things to talk in this presentation. Is the first presentation the Ibero-American Beer Cup do, okay? How the project is a competition of home brewing and a much more beer, okay? Because the pandemic we have to don't do in this year the contest, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And we do the contest in the next year. I hope.
I hope so too.
I hope. And I hope you stay here. We have to taste beer with hot. David, you go say anything about say now, or we go home with the presentation?
Um, I'm really glad to be here, and I'm happy to jump straight into the presentation if you're ready.
Okay, let's go.
Okay.
I hope these few people we have enjoy the presentation. We are record this presentation, okay? And I hope in the channel this week or the next week, okay?
Okay.
Well, let's do the presentation.
I think I see it now.
Okay.
We all set?
Okay, we are go.
Okay. If
Is all your.
Oh, thank you so much. And if at any point you're having trouble hearing me or any issues, just
Okay,
feel
no
free to
problem.
interrupt.
Okay,
Interrupt.
don't worry, don't worry. I avis you. Okay.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to talk with you guys today. I really enjoyed my time a couple years ago in Cadiz in Spain, talking at the Congress there, and this is a great chance to meet up, hopefully, with some of you again. Today, I'll be talking a little bit about how to homebrew lager, and first, I'll do just a little introduction here. We are offering a membership promotion with the American Homebrewers Association as part of this. So if you are currently a member of the AHA, or if you would like to renew, or if you would like to become a member of the AHA, you can do so with this activation code Club5Off, and I will distribute these slides afterwards so that you don't have to worry about copying down the links or anything. They'll all be live in the PDF that I send out, so that you can click right through to join or renew. Just tell you a little bit about myself. I've been working for the American Homebrewers Association for almost 5 years now. I started in 2016. I'm editor of Zymergy magazine, so this one right here. If you get it, if you're international, outside the United States, you probably get it as a digital magazine, but some people do get the copies shipped overseas. And I've been editor of Zymergy for, again, almost 5 years. I'm the author of this book about lagers, and this was published in 2017, I believe. I did receive word that the publisher is not planning a reprint of the first edition anyway. We haven't talked about a second edition yet, so if you don't have a copy, now would be the time to get it before they run out. And then I am also author of the Illustrated Guide to Homebrewing, which is a book about just how to homebrew, and it's a very straightforward book. I sort of say it's the type of book that I would give to my dad or to a brother or someone who isn't a homebrewer yet, but maybe interested. I'm a judge in the Beer Judge Certification Program, the BJCP. I'm also a certified Cicerone, and I just sat the written part of the Advanced Cicerone exam, which was offered online. The tasting and in-person portion has to wait until COVID-19 is over, but at least that part's out of the way. I've been homebrewing for a little over 10 years, and people often ask, what's your favorite beer style? And I can't say all of them because I guess that's not a satisfactory answer. So I narrowed it down to some of my favorite lager styles. The first three are pale lagers, Munich Helles, Bohemian Pilsner, and Pale Keller beer. And then I do love smoked beers, Rauch beer of all kinds. And that's definitely something I try to introduce more and more people to is smoked beer. So we'll just jump into the technical part here and go over the basics. What is lager? Lager is a whole family of beer styles. It's not just one type of beer. And what distinguishes lager from other beer styles is the cold fermentation, which takes place generally around 7 to 13 degrees Celsius. It is fermented using a distinct yeast strain, Saccharomyces pastorianus, which is actually a hybrid of two parent strains. Saccharomyces cerevisiae is classic ale yeast, and Saccharomyces eubayanus is a strain that was found in Patagonia, actually. And the scientists originally hadn't identified what that second parent was, but they knew from DNA testing that there was a second parent, and it was just, I think in 2013, 2014, that they identified eubayanus as the other parent. Lagers historically undergo a long period of cold conditioning near the freezing point of water, 0 degrees Celsius, and you can expect from a lager fermentation that you're going to get a much cleaner expression of malt and hops with less yeast character than you would get from a top fermenting an ale strain. I think just as important is to say what isn't lager. And one of the things that really got me interested in talking about lagers and researching them is running across misinformation that lager automatically meant Pilsner or something that was yellow and light-bodied. It can be that for sure, but it can also be a Baltic Porter or a Doppelbock or any number of dark, flavorful beers. And certainly it's not easier to brew than ale, and it doesn't have to be less alcoholic than ale. And in fact, one of the world's strongest beers, Samichlaus, comes from a brewery in, I believe it's in Switzerland, maybe Austria now. And it's a 14% alcohol by volume Doppelbock, one of the world's strongest beers, and it's a lager. So lager can be a lot of different things, and that's really what I try to convey. I just put a few of the probably the more famous lager styles up here for you. If you are a beer nerd or you're a home brewer, then you probably know about these, most of these already. But just wanted to throw those up here for you to take a look at. The ones I would like to draw your attention to on the left-hand column, pale and amber lagers, they're at the bottom. California Common, which the most famous commercial example of that is Anchor Steam, brewed in California. That is a lager beer, but it happens to be brewed a little bit warmer than most lagers, but it is a lager. It's a Saccharomyces pastorianus yeast strain that makes it. So it sometimes gets forgotten about in all of those others. And then over there on the right-hand side under dark lagers, again at the bottom, Baltic Porter is one that often gets forgotten about. And that's the one I like to show to people if someone says, I really like imperial stouts, but I don't like Pilsner, I don't like lagers. Then hand them a Baltic Porter, and it's sort of the imperial stout of the lager world. So just a few of the more famous styles there for you to take a look at. If you are comfortable brewing ales already, then you're 3/4 of the way to brewing lagers because you have experience with malt, hops, and water. And there is absolutely nothing to stop you from brewing a lager using ingredients more typically associated with ale brewing. So if you get your hands on some Maris Otter from England, or let's say Golden Promise from Scotland, some craft malts from where you live, and maybe you have, American Cascade hops, you can totally brew a lager with that, and it's likely to be very good. And so don't let classic beer styles fence you in too much. Feel free to experiment. That said, if you are aiming to do a traditional classic style, then definitely look at those traditional ingredients. So, for a Munich Dunkel, that would be Munich malt. For a Vienna lager, it would be Vienna malt. For a Bohemian Pilsner, it would be Moravian Pilsner malt. So look at those, or Zatz hops, for example, for a Pilsner. So if you're trying to target a traditional style, definitely look at those traditional ingredients. And where things really change for lager brewing is with the yeast. And When I first started homebrewing, there were just a handful of lager yeasts available, and now the selection is amazing. I've just listed out a few here. The top part bullet there, some of the German strains available. The Weihenstephan 3470 strain is probably the most famous, widely used lager strain in the world, and it's a workhorse. It's an excellent lager strain. It's what I use most of the time. It's available in dry form. Really great lager strain. Augustiner, the Augustiner brewery's yeast has become more available in recent years, and the Ondex strain. So there are lots of options when it comes to German lagers. The next bullet there, those are Czech strains. So the Pilsner Urquell lager strain, the Budějovice lager strain, those will tend to throw a little bit more butterscotch, a little bit more diacetyl than you would get with some of the cleaner lager strains. But they offer a nice round mouthfeel. Swiss lager is it's most commonly, I think, available as S189 from Fermentis, but certainly the liquid yeast manufacturers make it as well. It's great for high gravity brews. That Sami Klaus that I mentioned earlier, that 14% double bock would use with that strain. And then the California lager associated with Anchorstein. And American lagers, if you wanted to brew, say, an American light lager or an international pale lager, then you might go for an American lager strain. So if you've decided you want to brew a lager, then the first thing you need to do is make wort. And there really doesn't have to be a difference between the way you make wort for ale and the way you make wort for lager. And so what I tell people is to do what you are most comfortable with and what makes you happiest in the brew day. So if you want to have a shorter brew day, then the single temperature infusion mash is your best friend. With all the malts that we can get nowadays, all modern malts, they're well modified and they work well with this kind of mash protocol. And it's as simple as infusing hot water into the grain, allowing it to sit for 60 to 90 minutes, and then running it off and boiling it. What I think can really separate a good lager and make it into a great lager is to do a step mash, where you actually carry the mash through an increasing series of temperatures. And as I said, the modern malts available are all fairly well modified. So you don't strictly need to do a step mash for conversion purposes. However, because you're taking it through those different rests, you're promoting alpha and beta amylase to work within their preferred regimes. It tends to accentuate dryness in the finished beer. It gets you better attenuation. And I think when I taste a homebrewed lager or even a craft brewed lager versus some of the more famous larger lager brewers, I think that step mash is often what sets them apart. The protein rest these days, you almost really don't need it. Again, most of the malts we have are fairly well modified, so you can do a protein rest, but just keep it relatively brief. The exception, I would say there, is if you're using a large amount of adjunct, especially something like flaked corn, maize, then you would want to incorporate a protein rest to take care of the proteins in those unmalted adjuncts. If you are doing a step mash, then you have some different options for getting from one rest to the next. Perhaps the simplest way for a homebrewer to do it is to simply add an infusion of hot water to the mash tun. I mash in an insulated cooler, so that's how I do a lot of my steps. The problem you run into with hot water infusions is that the more steps you have and the thinner the mash gets, at some point you start to run out of room in your mash tun, and then it's hard to get another temperature increase. If you have an ability to direct heat your mash, either through a direct flame on the mash tun itself or through a recirculating type system, then you can apply direct heat to it to raise the temperature. And then decoction is probably the most complicated, but it's the most traditional way for preparing wort for a lot of these types of beers. And you'll hear a lot of homebrewers say that decoction isn't really necessary, and I agree in the sense that it won't change your beer dramatically, but it can change your beer quite a bit. And the example I use is for just to compare these two beers. They're both European Pilsners. The left one is Rothaus Pils from southern Germany, and the one on the right is Pilsner Urquell from the Czech Republic. And one of the main differences between these two beers, at least in terms of the wort, is that the Pilsner Urquell has undergone a triple decoction mash protocol and then an extended boil as well. There's no caramel malt in Pilsner Urquell. The color difference that you get there is entirely from the process part, the decoction and the extended boil. And so if you taste those two beers side by side, there are obviously other differences, like the hops and the yeast that are used and the water for sure. But the malt profile of the Pilsner Urquell will have more of a rich bread type of quality versus more of the clean sort of cracker quality of the Rothaus Pils. So if you want to experiment with decoction to produce some of these effects, I encourage you to do it, especially if you mash in a cooler. It can be a great way to move your mash through those rests without thinning out the mash too much. Regardless of how you get to get your wort, then you have to decide what yeast you want to use to ferment it. And there are lots of options out there. I went over a few of them earlier. And one thing that's worth knowing is that lager yeasts will tend to have more in common with each other than ale yeasts do. If you were to take a grist of, let's say, 50% Pilsner malt and 50% wheat malt and ferment it with an American ale strain, a Saison strain, and a German Hefeweizen strain, you're going to get three very different beers from the same original wort. Whereas if you ferment that wort with three different lager yeasts, you'll see some differences between them for sure, but the differences between the lager strains is going to be much less pronounced than from ale strains. So what I encourage homebrewers to do is to choose one yeast and really get to know it, rather than sort of jumping all over the map between different types of yeast for lager beers. Get to know one yeast, get to know it well, and I think you'll be well served. I do encourage homebrewers to pitch a lot of yeast. We'll go over that in just a sec. Probably more than you're accustomed to pitching, and to do it cold. You'll see a recommendation from time to time to pitch your yeast warm, 20 degrees Celsius, say, and then when you start seeing things happening, to cool it down. I don't like to do it that way. I find that I tend to get more off flavors like that. If I pitch enough yeast, I can pitch it cold and still see activity in a reasonable amount of time. And don't be afraid of the smell of rotten eggs, because that will come out of your fermentation, probably. Lagers do tend to throw more of the hydrogen sulfide which is the rotten egg aroma. So if you smell that, it just means things are working. So it'll go away with time. Let's just talk about liquid yeasts for a little bit. If you choose to use a liquid yeast, then I recommend figuring out how many cells that you need. And again, the pitch rate for lagers, I like to use at least twice as much as I would for ales. So the pitch rate I recommend is 1.5 to 2 million cells per milliliter per degree Plato of original extract. So that's, again, twice or more than twice what you would use for an ale. Now, if you run that math on the sorts of volumes that we as homebrewers use, about 19 liters. If you're using 12.5 Plato wort, then that means you need somewhere from 350 to 475 billion cells. And if we're talking about 15 degree Plato wort, more into Bach territory, then 500 billion plus or minus a few cells. So we're looking at anywhere from 1 to 6 packs of yeast, depending on how much yeast is in your pack. The white labs and white yeast typically say around 100 billion cells in a pack. Some of the newer manufacturers are putting 200 billion cells in a pack. Regardless, though, that means you're going to need a lot of yeast. And so you can either buy several packs, and that's perfectly fine. It's a great way to get fresh, healthy yeast. Or If you want to make a starter, that's I think a more economical way of kind of stepping up your yeast so that you have a lot for your fermentation. I like to do a two-stage starter. So I will propagate yeast initially at room temperature and just with the idea of growing yeast. So that might be a 2-liter starter. I'll let it ferment out completely and I will put it in the refrigerator and then allow the yeast to settle out. And then while it's in the refrigerator, I'll prepare separately maybe 5 liters of starter wort. And then whenever it is cooled down to fermentation temperature, I will pull the yeast out of the refrigerator, decant off the liquid, and then put it into that larger starter wort and have it in the fermentation refrigerator on brew day so that it is actively fermenting whenever I'm ready to pitch it. So that way I'm pitching a large amount of actively fermenting yeast, and I can ensure yeast health that way. Certainly you don't have to do it that way. It's just what I found works well for me. The question does come up, do you propagate lager yeast at room temperature versus in the cold? And if you're pitching the whole starter, then I would propagate it in the cold because you don't want to stress out the yeast when you introduce it to your lager wort. But if you're just allowing the yeast to crash out and decanting the spent liquid and pitching the slurry, then I would say you could propagate that at room temperature, no problem. You can avoid a lot of that planning by using dry yeast, which is what I usually do. And dry yeast is easier to work with. It doesn't have to be rehydrated, and you don't have to oxygenate your wort with dry yeast. So you can take wort that you've taken, crash down to the fermentation temperature, sprinkle dry yeast directly onto it, and you're ready to go. So it avoids a lot of the work that you have to do to prepare the yeast. Depending on who you ask, dry yeast will offer anywhere from 5 billion to 20 billion cells per gram. If you ask a manufacturer like Lallemand or Fermentis, they're probably going to say 5 or 6 billion cells per gram. But I've seen studies that where people have done cell counts on individual strains and gotten anywhere from 15 to 20 billion cells per gram. It will depend on the manufacturer. It will depend on the strain. I like to just make a blanket assumption of 8 to 10 billion cells per gram. I think that's a good compromise between spending a lot of money and kind of going crazy with the math. So if you run that math for a typical 11 and a half gram packet of yeast, that means you're in the neighborhood of 100 billion cells or so, which still means about 3 packets of yeast for about 19 liters of 12.5 degree Plato wort. Lallemand has a great yeast calculator. I've linked to it in here. It's a good place to start. So I recommend checking that out and also trusting your results. So if you run through all the math and it says you need to use 3 packets, but you find that 2 packets turns out beer that you enjoy, then by all means, go with the 2 packets. No need to spend more money than you have to. If I am pitching, let's say this 18.9 liters of 12.5 degree Plato wort, I'm sorry for I put all this together in U.S. and English units, so I'm trying to think about it all in metric as I go. So 19 liters of 12.5 degree Plato wort. I would pitch that with 2 packs of Weihenstephan 3470. I like the results I get from that, even though the math would strictly say that you need 3. So kind of feel free to play with it and choose the pitch rate that really works best for you. Once you have pitched your yeast, then it's time for the fermentation. And the traditional way that a homebrewer would ferment lager is to pitch the yeast, allow it to completely ferment out, and then chill it down to lagering temperatures. And you can certainly make great beer doing that. A little bit faster way to do it, and this is how a lot of the big lager breweries do it these days, is to do an initial cold fermentation, and then after a period of time, raise the temperature by a few degrees. And my apologies, the chart is in Fahrenheit, so we'll have to do some math to get it to where we want to go. But raise it by a few degrees partway through fermentation, and then that'll take care of the diacetyl rest. It will accelerate the yeast metabolism, allow them to kind of clean up after themselves, and then you can drop down to lagering temperatures. Now, the question then is, when do you raise the temperature? And I think a good answer for that is when about 2/3 of the available sugar has been consumed. So just to make the math easy, I'm going to work in specific gravity. So if you have an original gravity, let's say of 1.040, and you expect final gravity to be 1.010, then that's 30 gravity points that you need to get through, and 2/3 of 30 is 20. So 20 gravity points taken away from 1.040 is 1.020. So for that beer, whenever I measured the specific gravity had fallen to 1.020, I would go ahead and raise the temperature at that point. And you're not really risking any off flavors or any issues there. One thing that has become more accessible to homebrewers in recent years is pressurized fermentation. So if you have historically fermented in a glass carboy or in a plastic bucket or something like that, then it's hard to pressurize a container like that. However, a lot of homebrewers now have access to stainless vessels, whether it's a dedicated conical fermenter or a keg, something that can accept pressure. And if you are able to pressurize your fermenter, then you can actually ferment warmer and get lagers done faster. So the White Labs yeast lab has developed WLP 925 high pressure lager yeast, but you can really do this technique with a lot of different yeasts. And the idea is you ferment at close to room temperature with an atmosphere of pressure, so 1 bar, 1,000 millibar of pressure applied to it. And the yeast will basically, the pressure suppresses ester and phenol formation and allows the yeast to produce a fairly clean beer in a relatively short amount of time. And then you can lager that beer for 3 to 5 days near the freezing point of water, again with a bar of atmosphere or a bar of pressure applied to it, and turn out a fairly clean lager in just a couple of weeks. So if you have the ability to ferment under pressure, then that might be something you consider. There are some homebrewers who have taken this even a step further, and they do true warm lager fermentations with no applied pressure and just allow it to run at 20 degrees Celsius. And I think your results will vary. However, I would like to point you to a presentation that was delivered at HomebrewCon a couple of years ago by a representative from Fermentis. And the Fermentis Yeast Lab has put their Weihenstephan 3470 through a number of trials where they varied original gravity, they varied pitch rate, and they varied fermentation temperature. And they took all of the resulting beers from those trials and they put them in front of a tasting panel. And they also did, they put them under lab equipment to measure the concentrations of off flavors. And what they found is that Weihenstephan 3470 can actually ferment at, under certain conditions, at 20 degrees Celsius without having any discernible off flavors. And so if you don't have the ability to ferment in the cold, then you might consider trying Weihenstephan 3470 just at room temperature and see what you think, because there are homebrewers who are doing that, and the results from Fermentis seem to bear that out. On that note, Fermentis is in the process of doing all of these trials with all of their yeasts that are available. So if you go to the Fermentis website, you can download that data that they have on the different yeasts to kind of see what the conditions are that they're doing. The lagering phase is the cold conditioning phase that happens after fermentation. And historically, it's as cold as you can get it without it actually freezing. And you let it go for several weeks. I have found that fermentation, a good clean primary fermentation, is actually more critical than the lagering phase. So the lagering phase, you can get away with a little bit of less precision, I think. I've done some of my lagers after I fermented them cold. I've sort of just put them in the corner at room temperature and been happy with the results several weeks later. So the reason I bring this up is not to discourage homebrewers from doing the lagering phase, because that definitely can improve the beer. The reason I bring it up is that many of us, myself included, only have one temperature controlled chamber. So if let's say I brew a Helles or a Pilsner, and it ferments in a couple of weeks, and then I'm looking at 4 to 6 weeks of lagering, I could be using that fermentation chamber to brew other things, to ferment a stout or a saison. And so, do I really want to tie up my fermentation chamber for 4 to 6 weeks just keeping a lager cold? It depends on what your goals are, but for me, I found that if I'm really careful with that primary fermentation, that I can be a little less careful with the lagering and be happy with the beer that I get. Just wanted to mention a few of the off flavors you may encounter with lagers. There on the left, dimethyl sulfide is not really a property of lager brewing per se, but more that pale lagers tend to include a lot of Pilsner malt. And Pilsner malt is high in the precursor S-methylmethionine, which when heated becomes dimethyl sulfide. It's often described as having a corn or maize-like character. I perceive it actually more as a canned tomato, or some people actually get it as a shellfish kind of character. And if you use a lot of Pilsner malt, then DMS is definitely something to watch. Over on the right, diacetyl is the butterscotch or buttery type flavor, and in fact, it's the same compound that's in the popcorn at the theaters. And that is a natural byproduct of fermentation. Every yeast strain produces it. With ale yeast, it happens to be warm enough that they'll tend to clean up that compound more readily. So it's recommended with lagers that you do a diacetyl rest or a warming of the primary fermentation to reduce the amount in the finished beer. And then the two sulfur compounds, excuse me, that you're likely to find. Hydrogen sulfide is never really welcome. The rotten egg smell. You'll probably smell it in the fermentation chamber while the beer is fermenting, but you really don't want any of that in the finished beer. Sulfur dioxide, on the other hand, which is kind of that struck match aroma, a little bit of that I think actually really benefits a lot of, especially pale lager styles. And again, just a touch, not tremendous amounts of the stuff, but when you crack open that beer and you just get that initial kind of smell, I think a little bit of sulfur dioxide can be beneficial to certain styles. But you definitely don't have to go out of your way to try to create it. Just a couple of advanced topics I wanted to touch on. Again, homebrewers these days, we have access to much nicer hardware than we did years ago. So if you ferment with a pressure-capable vessel, like a stainless fermenter, then you can do what's called spunding, which is associated with lager brewing because German brewers, the Reinheitsgebot prevents them from adding carbon dioxide into the beer, so it has to come naturally from the beer itself. And spunding is just a technique where it's kind of like English cask ale. You sort of seal up the fermenter right before fermentation is complete and allow those last few bits of fermentable sugar to create the carbonation. And it's a little tricky to do in a carboy. I wouldn't recommend it, but if you have a pressure-capable fermenter, then you can attach one of these valves to it. And I've put two examples there. One on the top is a tri-clamp version, and the one on the bottom can attach to the ball lock, gas ball lock port on a keg. And they have a nice little dial and a pressure relief valve. So you just sort of set the relief valve at the pressure that you want, and as fermentation wraps up, the valve will vent excess carbon dioxide. So it allows you to carbonate using your primary fermentation. And so you can get the rule of thumb is you get 2 grams per liter of CO2 for every half a degree Plato of fermentable sugar. So if you want, let's say you want let's say 5 grams per liter, that's going to be about 2.5 degrees Plato, I guess, of residual sugar. Poisoning is the other advanced topic I wanted to touch on. It's not something most homebrewers are going to bother with. Basically, it means you allow your beer to continue fermenting, let it completely finish out, and then when you're ready to package it, you introduce just a little bit of actively fermenting beer. That's another Reinheitsgebot compliant way of getting carbonation. It works really well in a professional brewery because professional breweries brew the same thing over and over and over, and they have the same beer at various stages of completion. So it doesn't take a whole lot to borrow a little bit of actively fermenting beer and put it into the finished beer before packaging. Homebrewers tend not to brew the same thing over and over, and certainly we tend not to have the same beer at various stages of finishing. So I don't think this is something that most homebrewers are going to bother with. The one time that I would encourage that you look into krausening is if you bottle condition your beer and if you've struggled with oxidation related issues. Krausening, that extra little bit of fermentation can help scrub some of the oxygen and result in a cleaner finished product. The math can be a little tricky, so I've linked to an article in Zymergy where Chris Colby goes through all of the math on how to do that. So if you ask me what are my kind of top 5 tips for brewing lagers, the first one I would say use traditional ingredients for traditional styles. So if you're looking to get a medal with a let's say a Bock, then seek out that German Munich malt and get a traditional yeast strain that is associated with Bock. But don't be afraid to experiment. If you're not interested in competing, if you just want to brew something you enjoy drinking, then make a lager from whatever you've got and have fun with it. It can be a really fun process to sort of try avant-garde ingredients and don't feel like the Reinheitsgebot binds you to not putting fruit in your lager, or feel free to experiment. When working with lager yeast, do pitch more yeast than you think you need. Use those calculations to get an estimate of how much yeast that you need. And if you're using enough yeast, then it's okay to pitch it cold. You don't have to worry too much. I think a lot of homebrewers do get worried when they pitch the yeast and they don't see activity in the first 2 days. Lager fermentations are very quiet. So if you pitch a lot of yeast at the beginning, you don't have to stress out if things aren't taking off immediately. It's working. It's just taking its time. Don't worry too much about the lagering phase if you don't have a good way to keep beer cold for that long. If you can, then by all means do it, but don't worry about it too much if you can't. And finally, trust your experiences and remember that things work differently at the homebrew and professional scales. So just because something works for a professional doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work for a homebrewer, and the other way around too. If you visit, a new craft brewery shortly after they open, the beer isn't always that great, and part of that is that it takes time to take your homebrewing experience and sort of scale it up to a professional level. And so the opposite is true. If you read that professional brewers do it this way, that doesn't always mean it's going to scale to what we do. I've also linked to a number of my favorite books here. I've got mine in there, of course, but the book Yeast by Chris White and Jamil Zainasheff is really good for reference. So if you want to learn about pitch rates and yeast metabolism, how to propagate yeast in a sanitary way, it's a really good resource. If, like me, you're interested in the history aspect of things, A Brief History of Lager by Mark Dredge came out a couple years ago, and it's a very accessible little volume. And then New Brewing Lager Beer is a good classic book. It's been around for a little while, but there's still a lot of good information in there. And then my friend Andreas Krenmeyer has written a couple of great books. Historic German and Austrian Beers for the Home Brewer came out a few years ago, and his most recent book, Vienna Lager, came out not too long ago. And it's probably the best book out there on Vienna Lager if you're interested in that style. A lot of great history in it, a lot of good information. So again, these are all linked in the presentation that I'll make sure gets sent out afterwards, so you can click through to find those. And then I'll also just remind you of the promo that we have going on. So if you're interested in joining the American Homebrewers Association and getting Zymergy magazine, either on your iPad or in your mailbox, then you can use that link to take $5 off. And that is all that I have. So I will be happy to address any questions that you might have. Have we had any questions come through?
Okay. Okay, David. I don't know if we have any question. Let me see. In this
Okay.
moment, don't have any question. Okay. At
Okay.
this moment. Okay.
Sure.
Let me see. Se alguém tem alguma questão e quer colocar alguma questão ao David, por favor, acho que está na altura. David, there was a very good presentation, indeed.
Thank you. Thank you.
I like, and I hope these few people here have enjoyed your presentation. Okay.
My pleasure.
No, the pleasure is mine. Have a good communication like you is very, very good. Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. Well, it seems not any question in this moment. Okay.
I will just note that I put on the first slide my email address.
Okay.
So that if you have questions afterwards, definitely feel free to email me and I can help.
Okay. 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 And only to say I have the magazine yet. Okay.
Yay! That makes me happy.
Yes, very. And we are here.
Yes.
Yes. David, I hope you see you again here.
I hope so.
Okay.
I hope we can travel again soon and I can attend your next event.
Yes, yes. I maybe in the next we are here. We have another webinar with you, with another other team. Okay.
I'd be happy to.
The one you like, the history beers.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Yes.
I hope the people like the history beers. There was a very good team. Okay.
Mhm.
Okay, David. Thanks very much for your
Thank you very
presentation.
much.
Okay.
And I hope you have a great evening.
Yes, yes. I'm more easy now. Okay. You know.
All right.
Okay.
Well, thank you very
Okay.
much and I hope to see you soon.
Okay. Thank to you.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks. See ya.
Bye-bye.
Bye.